Joe Marino.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So you are a friend of Barry Schwartz,
hmm
who I have interviewed on two different occasions. You are an authority on the Shroud of Turin. And before we get into the meat of that subject matter, maybe you can give a little bit about your background.
Sure. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, born in 1954. I was the youngest of five, and my parents' names were Mary and Joseph. So when I started lecturing on the Shroud later, I used to, at one point in my younger days, I was about the same height and weight as the man in the Shroud. So when I was
Oh,
lecturing, I would say, um, I'm about the same height and weight as the man in the shroud, and my parents' name are Mary and Joseph. So you can make your own
oh,
conclusions about that.
I
Um,
see.
but anyway, my dad was a Sicilian immigrant. He came over to this country when he was 15, became a tailor. My mom was born of Sicilian parents, and she was born in this country. All four of my grandparents uh, were born in Sicily. So I grew up in I would say a lower middle class family in St. Louis, and I went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school, and had never heard of the Shroud. In the Catholic tradition, there's something known as Veronica's Veil, which is incorporated into the Catholic devotion called the Stations of the Cross. And the legend is that a woman wiped Jesus's face with a towel and an image appeared on it.
Okay.
And that could be an ideological story to explain having had the shroud in history, which was probably folded up at one point just so that only the face was showing, because it's 14 feet long. So you don't want to carry
Okay.
around. So if you fold it up, it's easier to transport, obviously. So that
Ah,
might have been a legendary story. And a clue to that is the fact that the woman's name is Veronica, which is made up of Vera icon, which means true image. So
oh,
that suggests that that's just kind of an appropriate name for a woman like that.
okay.
So I became agnostic, I guess, in probably late high school or after I graduated. Um, but I was interested in religion and philosophy, and when I would go to bookstores, I would also always go to the religion and philosophy section first. And at that point, my I was totally open. I was reading Christian, non-Christian, philosophy and religion. And in the spring of 1977, I went to a Walden bookstore in town, and I saw a paperback that had a picture of the face of Jesus from the negative, which is the lifelike image. And it was called, let's see, the Fifth Gospel, subtitled "Is This the Face of Jesus Christ?" So I thought, well, this looks like an interesting reading. Never heard of the Shroud, as I said, but I bought the book, brought it home, read it in one sitting, and was just absolutely fascinated by it. And I thought, man, based on the evidence, I think it could be real. And of course, that was before Stirp even went over to Turin the next year, so there wasn't all that much information in the Western world about it. It was well known in Europe and France and Italy, because they had a longer history going back to the 1350s with it. So, but based on the evidence, I thought it might be authentic, and so I just started trying to find any books and articles I could find on it. So I remember getting a folder, and I had 7 articles, and I thought, wow, look at this collection, which was nothing compared to what I have now. Because I have probably have the best personal English language collection of shroud materials in the world. My whole basement is just file
Ah,
cabinets and tons of things down there. 350 books, thousands of articles, correspondence, memorabilia, you
ah.
name it. So obviously it fascinated me, and I've read everything in the English language on it, and with the help of Google Translate, I've dipped into a lot of the foreign works, and thank goodness the Google Translate is pretty good. Translation software in the 90s was just horrible. It was next to useless. but the Google Translate is pretty good. So I've been able to, as I say, check out a lot of the Italian books and articles, or foreign books and articles, French, Spanish, Italian, mainly. So once I got in the monastery, I started lecturing. I started a print newsletter, which I sent out to, what was it? About 220 people in 23 countries. That was before the internet. Gosh. And now I do an electronic newsletter with, I think my list, including groups, I think it's about 330. Not sure how many countries that is, but I send out weekly updates of the latest information on the Shroud. And I enjoy doing it. And it's a lot of whatever videos, podcasts, books, articles, news. I compile those each week and send them to people interested in the Shroud. Anybody listening to this, if they want to join the list, all they have to do is send me an email at jmarino240@aol.com and ask to join to the list. Everybody on the list is blind copied, so your email is not shown to anybody, and one can request at any time to be taken off the list. No questions asked. So again, that was jmarino240@aol.com. So I've been keeping up with the Shroud to the minute since the spring of 1977. So I just passed 47 years of studying it. And I'm retired now, so I get to devote most of my time when I went to studying the Shroud. I've presented at conferences. I've written two books, over 100 articles. Yeah, I'm living the dream. So.
Okay, so by the sounds of the volumes of information that you have available, you must know every detail possible to know about this. I mean,
well, let's put it this way. Some people can read stuff and they can keep it in their head and give it back. I usually, I can't remember everything I read about it. So I kind of prefer writing as opposed to talking about it, because I can't remember all the details without looking at notes and books and articles and stuff.
So when you write about it, when you write about the Shroud, you have to reference the material that you have available?
I do in a lot of my articles. Some of the articles I write are more my own musings or reflections. And in cases like that, I don't necessarily have references or anything, but I might put a hot link to Barry's site or something here or there. But my more scholarly articles I reference. And my articles, can be 55, 65 pages. Now, in my recent article on the reweave, which I just sent out an update about, I think it was 66 pages and about 90-something references. So yeah, I like to document what I say. If it's a scholarly article, if it's my musings, I don't have to document. I tell people up front, this is what I'm thinking about the Shroud. But if I come up with a theory or something, I like to give them references of why I've come to that position on a scientific issue or whatever.
Huh. Okay, this may be a little bit more than the average viewer can take in. I think maybe you can get specific. You wrote 2 books on the Shroud.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was 400 pages long, and the second one was 800 pages long.
Basically, I think the first one with appendices and stuff, I think it was about 420 pages.
Okay.
And the
so
second
what was when was the first book written? And what did you try to cover in that book?
The first book was published in late 2011. And it was basically autobiographical. I gave a little family history, how I got involved in the Shroud, how I connected with Sue, and then some of the research that we did together. And in the appendices, I had important articles and correspondence with different people related to the research. And then I revised and updated that in I think summer of 2020. And then in the fall of 2020, I had my 800-page book, which was just on the C14, that was published, I think, November, late November or something like that of 2020. And then I knew there would be more material with that. And so I earmarked at first a page on my website for overflow. And I have over like 80 additional entries of data points. And then I later transferred that to an article on my academia page because academia gets more traffic than my personal website. So people can get that supplement to the book free by going to my academia page.
Okay, can we talk specifically about the shroud? You mentioned you were fascinated by this.
Mm-hmm.
You thought that it might be the genuine shroud that covered the body of Jesus. So from your initial impression, how long did it take you to be convinced? I assume you are convinced that it is the burial shroud of
absolutely.
Jesus.
I'm as sure that the shroud's authentic as I'm convinced of anything in this world.
Okay. So how long did it take you to go from thinking it was genuine to actually genuinely believing that it was genuine?
Well,
maybe that's a question you've never thought of before.
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, when I finished the book, I was pretty well convinced that it could be authentic. And I would say after the Stirp study in 1978 and when they came out with their final report in 1981, I would say by 1981, I was pretty much 100% convinced that it was the real thing.
By 1981. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But you say your book didn't come out until 2011.
My first book was 2011. Yeah.
Okay. So what was it that convinced you that this was a genuine shroud? Like, what were the things that you were looking at or considering in order to make that determination?
Well, I guess the three main areas would be the history of the shroud. Are there any indications in history that such a cloth could have existed all the way back to the 1st century? There was the theological aspect. That did it match with the Bible accounts? Science, did the science that had been done on the shroud indicate that it was probably authentic? And if you look at the background of Stirp, although there's sometimes they've been accused of being pseudo-religious nuts, that's just wrong. They weren't. These guys were from Los Alamos, Sandia Laboratories, Jet Propulsion Laboratories. This wasn't a religious mission. Barry didn't even know most of the people's religious affiliations. I mean, he knew that Jackson and Jumper, who had co-founded Stirp, were both Catholics. There were a couple Jewish guys on the team, Barry, Don Devan, and Al Adler. Vern Miller was Mormon. He didn't know most of the other ones. This was not a religious enterprise. They didn't go over there to prove that the shroud proves the resurrection. These were hardcore science guys. They worked in the country's nuclear and space programs. They put people in space. They built bombs. They might have had some religious bias of some kind, but I think most scientists have to try to keep their biases to a minimum. They were sent over there to try to find out one thing: how did that image get on the shroud? And guess what? They couldn't figure it out. Some of those guys Barry thought they could figure it out in 30 minutes and could all go home. And nobody ever figured it out. And when you see in the press or in articles by skeptics saying, oh, they were pseudo-religious nuts, that is total nonsense. So that was a big factor, the fact that these brilliant guys, and a few women on the team, A lot of PhDs, people that put people into space and build bombs, they couldn't figure out how it got on there, and that carried a lot of weight with me. And along the way, I actually had a few what I would call a kind of mystical experiences, personal mystical experiences that convinced me that the shroud was real. Now, that's the type of experience that I realize is not going to convince somebody, but when it happens to you, you know, it's pretty powerful, and that's part of the data for me that tells me or makes me believe that the shroud is authentic.
Okay. So, what do you know about the history of the shroud as far as how back it can be traced and what
Yeah.
kind of evidence there is of
Um,
this in the historical account?
sure. Well, another thing that the skeptics will say that it's really not accurate uh, is that they will say there's no references to the shroud before the 14th century. Just as, the shroud historically surfaces around 1355 in Lorraine, France. And it shouldn't have to be pointed out, but it needs to be pointed out that, yes, if you look in the history before 1350, you will not find any references at all to the Shroud of Turin because it didn't become the Shroud of Turin until 1578. It was first called the Shroud of Lorraine, and then the Shroud of Chambéry, and then the Shroud of Turin. So
Okay.
obviously, if the shroud's authentic and it existed before the 1350s, it would have been called something else. And history records a well-known image called the image of Edessa, which Ian Wilson wrote a book on in 1978, and he believes that the image of Edessa was actually the Shroud of Turin.
Okay.
And then it was later transferred to Constantinople in 944 and became known as the Mandylion. And then it was stolen apparently from Constantinople in 1204, and then it goes missing for about 150 years. And then it shows up, as I said, in Lorraine, France in about the 1350s. So I did what was it, a 55-page paper that's on my academia page that documents all the references. And the way I phrased the title was documented references to Jesus's burial cloths or linens before the middle of the 14th century here. And obviously not every one of those that I documented are going to be the shroud, but it's very possible that some are, that some of them might be. So, the shroud is obviously mentioned in all four gospels. Briefly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention the word sindon, which is a linen cloth, which would be equal to the shroud. John mentions he uses a Greek plural term called aphonia, which is basically means linen cloths, and it can include a larger cloth and then strips. Now, where people get thrown a lot is that their English translation Bible for John often uses the word strips, and then people automatically kind of think, oh, he was wrapped like an Egyptian mummy, which is not true. I mean, even by that time, the Egyptians had stopped wrapping mummy style. The strips referred to there could be the strips that would go around the wrists and the feet, and maybe other strips to keep the body within the larger shroud. Okay. Now, another thing that people don't realize is that in Luke's account, when he describes Peter and John going to the tomb, he doesn't use the word sindon like he had when he mentioned Joseph of Arimathea, using a sindon to wrap Jesus. When he uses the word aphonia, in I think it was 24:12, which is the same word that John used. So, aphonia, people get all oh, it can't be because there's strips. Well, it's not a good translation, and Luke uses both Sindon and Athonia, which shows you that the Athonia can include the Sindon. Okay.
Okay.
So, in the 2nd century, there's an apocryphal book known as the Gospel to the Hebrews, and most scholars think it's dated to the early 2nd century, possibly the late 1st century. It's a apocryphal book, and in that book, it says, when the Lord had given the linen cloth to the servant of the high priest, he went and appeared to James. So there's a reference to the linen cloth in the 2nd century. Now there's tons of references. I'll just go over a few of the more significant ones. And then there was a book in the 3rd century, an apocryphal book called the Acts of Thomas, and there's something in that book called the Hymn of the Pearl, and there's an interesting quote there where it says, it's kind of quoting Jesus, where he says, "I saw my image on my burial garment like in a mirror, myself facing outward and myself facing inward, as though divided, yet one likeness, 2 images, but one likeness of the King of Kings." Now that sounds like it could be referring to the shroud. Now there was in the 4th century, there was a pope named Pope Sylvester, and he instituted in the year 325 by papal decree that the church should celebrate Mass, which represents the body and blood of Jesus, that it should be celebrated on a linen cloth consecrated by the bishop, quote, as if it were the clean shroud of Christ. Okay. And then in the 5th century, there was a bishop named Theodore of Mopsuestia of Antioch. And he said, when they bring up the oblation at the offertory, they place it on the altar for the completed representation of the Passion, so that we may think of him on the altar as if he were placed in the sepulchre after having received the Passion. This is why the deacons who spread the linens on the altar represent the figure of the linen cloths at the burial. Okay. And then in the 6th century, there was a Spanish liturgical rite called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week, and they translated the verse in John as Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Okay, so we're talking about imprints on the linen. So that suggests that they may have seen or known about the shroud. Otherwise, why would you have that as the reference or the translation that way? That was 6th century. Now, by the 8th century, icons and that sort of thing had fell out of favor, and it was thought to be kind of a form of idolatry. So the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 wanted to kind of reinstall that veneration devotion in the Catholic Church. And they made a statement that said, in the 2 years preceding the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus Vespasian, the faithful were warned by the Holy Ghost to leave Jerusalem and go to the kingdom of Agrippa, still allied to the Romans. Thus, going forth from the city, they took with them their most precious objects. This is how the images and other sacred objects were taken to Syria, or Edessa, and were to be found there. And then, let's see, there was a Saint Theodore the Studite who lived in the 8th and 9th century. He referenced a linen cloth as a full body image in which the Christ was wrapped and laid down in the sepulcher. And then there's a long-standing tradition that in the early days, maybe even in the first century, that there was a King Abgar who had supposedly written a letter to Jesus asking him to come and heal him. And Jesus supposedly sent a letter saying that he couldn't come himself, but that he would send a disciple to him. And it's believed that someone, maybe possibly St. Jude, who you see depicted in icons sometimes with an image of Jesus, may have brought the shroud to King Abgar, who was supposedly healed and then converted to Christianity. So referring to that legend, Theodore the Studite said that that it was to clearly grant us his divine features, our Savior, who had been covered with it, imprinted the form of his own face and portraying it touching the cloth with his own skin. Then there was a Pope Stephen III, who gave support to the idea of restoring images in the Catholic Church again. And he said, Christ spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was white as snow. On this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most notable body has been divinely transferred. So here he's talking about not just the facial image, as perhaps the image of Edessa was shown sometimes, but he's talking about the length of the whole body. So, as I said, the image of Edessa was transferred to Constantinople in 944. And the night it arrived there was somebody named Gregory the Archdeacon, delivered a sermon on August 16th, 944. And the sermon was recorded, and he said, the splendor has been impressed uniquely by drops of agony, sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produce the coloring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image there. So he's referring to the side image, which again refers to a longer length or a full body image as opposed to just a facial image. So in the 11th century, there was a Latin version of that old Abgar legend that I've referenced. And in that version, it quotes Jesus as saying to Abgar, but if you wish to see my face in the flesh, behold, I send you a linen on which you will discover not only the features of my face, but a divinely copied configuration of my entire body. Now that's a relatively late version, but again, it's they were better in those days at oral transmission than we are, and so there seems to be that reference to a tradition of a full body being imprinted on a cloth. 12th century, there was a theologian named Ordericus Vitalis. He wrote something called the Ecclesiastical History in the year about 1141. And he wrote, a precious linen on which he had wiped off the sweat of his face, and on which an image of the same Savior shines forth, miraculously painted. Really, the word should be imprinted, because painted gives the impression that paint was used, but Stirp showed that there was no paint. Okay, and he says this image shows to whoever looks upon the appearance and size of the Lord's body. 13th century, Gervase of Tilbury says, the story is passed down from archives of ancient authority that the Lord prostrated himself with his entire body on the whitest linen, and so by divine power there was impressed on the linen a most beautiful imprint of not only the face, but the entire body of the Lord. Again, a full body image. And then probably the biggest pre-14th century image that a lot of people will have heard at some point was made in 1204 by a French knight by the name of Robert de Clary, who said, he said in 1204, "But among the rest of the churches in Constantinople, there was also another from which was called Saint Mary of Blachernae, within which was the shroud wherein our Lord was wrapped. And on every Friday that shroud did raise itself upright, so that the form of our Lord could be clearly seen, and none knows, neither Greek nor French, what became of that shroud when the city was taken." So when he says it was raised upright, some researchers have postulated some sort of mechanical device that would actually raise the cloth up so that you would slowly eventually see the whole cloth and the whole image.
And what year was that?
That was
1204.
1204.
1204.
Now, and one more, there's something also that a lot of people may have heard of, which is called the Hungarian Pray manuscript.
I've heard of that.
Dated 1192 to 1195, so just about 10 years before the Constantinople thing. And some researchers have found like 12 different features on the Hungarian Pray manuscript that seem to match to the shroud. Now you will find skeptics that say, no, that's not that. But one of the most interesting one is there's some L-shaped burn holes on the shroud. And you see that copied on the Hungarian Pray manuscript. And you have to ask, now, why in the world would an artist put L-shaped burn holes on a painting of Jesus unless he had seen that, was told or heard that it was the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and he thought, well, I don't know what this is, but if this is authentic, I ought to put it in there.
Yeah. Yes.
You know. So
yes.
Those are some of the more significant references pre-14th century that indicate that the shroud could have existed before that time.
So what? How would you describe the image that's on the Shroud of Turin?
Well, it's the complete front and back images. To the naked eye, it's not very detailed. You know, you could tell that it's the image of a man. You can see the frontal face, the arms crossed in front, the legs down to the feet, although part of the feet you can't quite see. Then the back image, you can see the back of the head, the back, the buttocks, the legs, and more of the feet on the dorsal image. It's not very clear, and in fact, you really need to be within about 6 to 10 feet when you're seeing it in person. If you get closer than 6 feet, you really can't see it too well. Or if you get further than 10 feet away, it gets a little bit harder to see. It's when you take the picture with and you get the negative. You know, young people today don't get too much about, you know, they're used to taking a picture and there it is. You know, us old timers had when we took pictures, we had to get, you know, we used film and took it to the drugstore and had to wait 24 hours, and we would get a pack of negatives back, and then you'd look at it and say, who or what is that? And then, but when you look at the pictures and it was positive on the pictures, you could tell. So the lifelike image of the shroud is what you see on the negative. The first picture was taken in 1898, and in those days they used glass plates. So when the Italian photographer, who was an amateur photographer, who was actually a lawyer, you have to remember that photography was really only invented in the early 19th century. So photography was only about 70 years old at the time. And when he developed the glass plate, he said he almost dropped it because he didn't expect to see a lifelike image from the negative. He wasn't sure what he was going to see, but he, because the original image is not very distinct as it is, but he sure didn't expect to see a positive or lifelike image on the negative.
So do you have any idea why that's the case. I'm trying to think if the burial cloth, would the burial cloth be, as it were, a negative? So you're taking a negative of a negative and getting a positive?
Basically, I mean, if you want to think of it that way, yeah, the image on the shroud is like a photographic negative. And so when you take a picture of it and it comes out positive, then yeah, but that's one way to think about it, I think.
So
And that's
I
one of
asked
the.
Bear. Mhm.
I was going to say that's one of the strange characteristics of it. And then
Yeah, it's very strange.
and skeptics will say, "Oh, he just happened to get that." I don't think
Okay,
so.
so excuse me. Has it ever been theorized? I mean, why that would be the case? So I'm just trying to think. You have the image that's on the shroud is the image of a crucified cadaver. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's it's a dead body,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess my assumption is that the power of resurrection made this dead body emanate some kind of energy or light or something
Radiation
that was actually broadcast onto the cloth.
right.
Is that your impression?
Yeah, most scholars will think that it's some sort of radiation or light, and I think a negative, and it comes from inside the body. Most people think. I mean, I think I've come across one or two people that think that the source is from the outside, but most researchers and scientists think that the source of the energy came from within the body.
Okay.
And when that happens, if that is the case, I think you would get a negative image.
Okay.
Inherently.
And I guess I'm trying to imagine this energy emanating from the body would have been life energy coming down from God, like God is energizing or giving life to this dead body, and the resurrection, like the time frame, if so potent an energy, if for lack of a better word, was emanating from the body, then the resurrection would have been a very instantaneous event. Like it was just a fraction of a second that all of a sudden this body goes from being dead to fully alive.
Yeah, in fact, there's been some experiments by some Italian scientists back in, I think it started around 2010, and they used lasers, and they were trying to see if they could approximate the color of the shroud, and they experimented with different amounts of energy and whatnot, and using a excimer ultraviolet laser on a control linen, they zapped a laser for like 1/40 billionth of a second and were able to somewhat approximate the color of the shroud image and the depth penetration of the shroud.
Okay.
Now, mind you, that's just one little spot. To be able to do that and somehow duplicate a front and back image of a whole man, there isn't enough energy on the planet to do that even now. So yeah, I mean, you were thinking 1/40 billionth of a second is hard to wrap your mind. That's practically instantaneous, I would say.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. Wow. So the significance of the shroud. So you were a Catholic monk. You were for 18 years, a Catholic priest for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And The Catholics, you must be aware better than myself, how many relics and icons
Yeah.
and how many of these things that people like, what do they actually do? They actually worship these things or give homage to them? Or how would you describe
Um,
what the Catholic approach is
yeah. The
to
yeah.
relics?
Yeah. The official term, the appropriate term to use is Catholics venerate a relic. They don't worship
Okay.
it. They don't pray to it. Um, they're allowed to venerate it. Um, in fact, I'm working on a new article that talks about holy objects. I don't in my article I don't like to use relic because it's loaded with baggage and
Uh-huh.
some people have negative connotations of it. But there are examples even in the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant, for example, where people venerated holy objects. And I'm going to go in chronological order and show different examples of how people attributed or felt that some objects were holy, um, and paid appropriate. I don't know if I want to use homage. That may be too strong of a word, but you're safe if you use the word venerate. You're not focusing on it for the sake of that object alone. It's because of its relationship to the holiness of God. It's a, when people have pictures of their loved ones on their desk, um, nobody's going to accuse them of thinking that if a guy's got a picture of his wife on the desk, that guy doesn't think that that's actually his wife. It's just a picture of her. It reminds him of her, and that's what I think relics can do. Now, personally, yeah, there were tons of relics. There were tons of relics in the 14th century when the shroud appeared. To me, the shroud is in a class by itself. I don't think you could say, oh, there were tons of fake relics. The shroud surfaced in the 14th century, therefore it was there. It's a fake relic. I mean, that's just illogical. You have to examine each object on its own merits. And the shroud is one of the most, if not the most, intensely studied artifact in human history in terms of the number of hours people have spent on it. Now, there's one skeptic in England and say, oh, if you do a Google search and do journal searches, I'm not talking about just journal searches. I'm talking about the number of research hours that people have spent on it. And it's an educated guess. The shroud's probably literally the most intensely studied artifact in human history. And to this day, nobody knows how the image got on the cloth. So I think that gives people the ability to say, okay, there's no natural image formation yet. There may be later, of course, but the fact that we've gone this long and nobody's come up with anything at least leaves open the idea that it could be supernatural. Now, some people don't even believe in the supernatural. So, there's nuance and that sort of thing when you discuss these things. But, Christians believe that we believe in the supernatural, so they're open to that idea.
What do you think? What do you think of the idea that this cloth should be taken seriously by more than just Catholics?
Yeah. Well, in fact, one of the reasons that a lot of Protestants don't pay attention to us is they often have a knee-jerk reaction to anything that they think is, quote, a Catholic relic. And so, and I've heard Protestants say, I didn't pay attention to it first because I thought it was a Catholic relic. And then they'll say something like it, but then I started studying on my own and I realized the evidence for it was very strong.
Okay.
So, if Jesus died for everybody, it's for everybody to look at, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
if it's real, I mean, it really enhances the scriptures, I think, to a degree, and gives us a better idea of what Jesus went through. Now, if you read the Gospels, one of the Gospels says, "And he was scourged." Okay, that tells us he was scourged, but that doesn't impact, I think, mentally or emotionally on you what he went through. But if you look at the shroud and you see the scourge wounds, and then you hear medical doctors talk about it, what happens when you're scourged, it puts some meat on it, you know. I think it's just an added thing. It's not something that's necessary, but I think if God tries to get people take the time to look at it. Like I say, I've been studying it 47 years. If it had been fake, I would have found out by now, But I think
Yes.
it's real, and that's why I keep studying it. And I think the shroud, if people can overcome some theological biases and look at it, I think they can find a wealth of good in it. Gary Habermas, Dr. Gary Habermas, uh, I saw him on a video recently or something I read by him, and he made a statement that I kind of repeat often now because I believe it's true. He says our beliefs are more affected by our worldviews than by facts. So anytime we're exposed to something, and a Protestant hears the shroud, oh, it's a Catholic relic. I don't want to, we all have biases of some kind. And I think everybody has to work to overcome their own biases and look at it honestly. And if you do, I think you're going to find some amazing things.
What what is the expression of Jesus's face on the shroud?
Oh, wow. That's, um, when I bought my first book, just the picture of the face, the lifelike. In other words, the negative of what's on the shroud. It was just the face, and sometimes people only see that. Some articles and books and stuff will show you the full front and back image, but I kind of like the close up of the face because it's so striking that he was beat so badly. If you look at the full images front and back, he was just scourged terribly and beaten terribly, and his nose was broken, and that's cartilage, by the way, and not bone. So that doesn't upset the prophecy about no bones shall be broken. But there's a peace and serenity in that face that when you think about it, you go, how could usually when you see somebody that's been murdered or something, you don't like to look at those pictures. And you could see the pain on their faces a lot of time, you know. But in this image, despite the fact that he was scourged and crucified, there's a just an incredible peace and serenity on that face that just at least it grabbed me, and it's never
Uh-huh.
let go. And I just never get tired of looking at it. It's just it just looking at the face for some people brings them to Jesus.
Well, strangely enough, when I was a 16-year-old boy, the documentary that came out in I think it was 1978 appeared on the TV in the evening, one evening, and I distinctly remember the picture of the face that was
Mm,
shown there, and it really impressed me as something very
mm,
serene, as you're describing.
yeah.
Like it looked like the face of a man who was anointed by God for a very special purpose, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a beautiful thing to behold. So
Mm-hmm.
I really that really made quite an impression on me. And
Yeah, it does for most people. Yeah.
mhm.
Mhm.
Wow. So I think maybe we can touch upon you, you talked about the points that the image cannot be reproduced. There's no scientific explanation, like there's no real scientific explanation of how the image got there. And yet there has been some pushback, scientifically speaking, to disprove the Shroud of Turin.
Sure.
And the most notable of this is the carbon dating research that was done. When was that done? In 1983, about 5 years after the Sturp
No, it was
team?
10 years after the Sturp investigation in 1988.
Okay. And can you describe how that research was done? Yeah, I mean, we don't want a 2-hour interview here, but just I think it would
hard.
be good to let the audience know, if you can, like what happened.
Well,
in this.
This is real. This is one of the hardest things I get asked in terms of trying to be brief, because I wrote an 800-page book about it.
I know.
And then a supplement with 82 entries. So, all right, I'll try to be as brief as possible. People started clamoring for carbon-14 dating, I think, around 1960. Carbon dating was only invented around the late 40s by Willard Libby. And the first method, you needed like a handkerchief size piece of linen. And of course, the church didn't want to do that because they didn't want to take that large of a piece. In the late 1970s, in 1977, there was a new method called AMS, Accelerated Mass Spectrometry, which was invented. And they reduced the amount that you needed to just several, a thread or two. So that was the year before Sturp did their testing. So it was just being developed in 77, so they didn't do a carbon-14 test in 78. And then in the early 80s, groups started clamoring for a C14 test, and Sturp wanted to do that as well. And they submitted to the church authorities a 26 test proposal to do further multidisciplinary tests like they did in 1978, and a separate C14 test. Now, the labs that were picked, they considered 7 labs first, and then they reduced that to 6, and then they reduced that to 3. Most of those labs thought that, we don't need those other 25 tests. C14 is good enough to tell us whether it's first century or not. Oh. And there was a lot of politics and agendas and egos, and the guy that co-invented the AMS method was a guy by the name of Dr. Harry Gove, and he was one of those guys that thought Sturp were a bunch of pseudo-religious nuts. So he worked behind the scenes to get Sturp eliminated, and he was eventually successful. Oh. So the church decided to let 3 AMS labs test it with no other testing. They had held a 3-day workshop in Turin in September and October of 1986 to establish the protocols for how the testing would be done. Well, come around April 21st, 1988, samples were taken, and despite the fact that protocols had been set back then, and more protocols came out as late as January 1988, on the day of the sample taking, 2 Italians argued for an hour and a half where the sample would be taken. It's like, folks, you had all those protocols. Why are you arguing now, the day of the sample? And they ultimately picked the one sample where Sturp says, no, don't take it from there because that area is possibly contaminated, repaired. It's not a good, and they took it from that sample. from that area, the sample from that area. And they cut it up into 3 samples. They kept the sample, and then they gave it to the other 3 labs. And then there was a lot of shenanigans that went on. The labs weren't supposed to consult with each other, and they did. They used different cleaning methods. They didn't release the raw data like they were supposed to. It took a Freedom of Information Act to finally get the data released after 29 years, and they found out that when they had concluded with 95% certainty that the Shroud dated at 1260 to 1390, that the actual data didn't warrant concluding that. So I think the carbon-14 has been, in most people's minds, has been totally discredited to the point where most people don't think that it's a valid data point. Now, there are still skeptics that bring that up and say, oh, it's authentic. But they only took one sample from a 14-foot-long cloth, 3.5 feet wide. You can't be sure that the STURP was worried that the area was repaired. And in fact, I've done a lot of work. My late wife and I did a lot of work on what's called the invisible reweave theory. There's been evidence that shows that there's cotton and other foreign type substances in that area that suggest that there was repairs done in that area. So it was a chaotic test. If people want all the details, they can check it out in my book. But they probably won't do another C14 test. When people ask that question, why don't they do another one? There are newer dating methods that are even non-destructive. And Turin actually has some material in vials stored away that they gathered after the 2002 restoration that they could actually test with carbon-14 if they wanted to, and without having to even to worry about taking new samples from the cloth. So, okay. A lot of politics involved. It's unfortunate because I've always felt that, the shroud belongs to the world. Technically, the owner of the shroud is the living Pope. But I think the shroud belongs to the world, and I think they should do more testing because I think it is an object that can help bring people to Jesus.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of what else I need to ask. I think I'd like you to tell the audience what the Shroud of Turin means to you and to your faith perspective.
Yeah. I would say, I went from being agnostic to the shroud helped me come back to my Christian roots. If I had to guess, I would have to say that it's very possible that I'd still be an agnostic without the shroud. I think it's it's if you can come to faith without needing like something like that, good for you. I needed something more. I don't think God objects to that. I mean, Thomas, the apostles told Thomas that they had seen Jesus, and that wasn't enough for him. He said, "I want to put my finger in the holes and my hand in his side, or else I'm not going to believe." And that was okay with Jesus. I mean, so. I think God, as I said, God will use multiple means to try to get people to get them to go to Him, and the shroud happens to be an object that He used with me. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I mean, it's obviously an important. I spend hours. I have no idea how many hours in my life I've spent on it, but it's thousands and thousands and thousands of hours.
There's another question that comes to mind too. When you think of the this item as a burial cloth of Jesus that would be almost 2,000 years old, that it could have survived, that it could have been, somehow this was preserved, it was cared for, it escaped the hands of those that would want to destroy it. If this really is the burial shroud of Jesus, I personally believe it is. For me, it's such an incredible miracle that this would have survived all the dangers, and of course the physical dangers too. And what happens to a cloth after it gets so old? Doesn't it decay? And the image on the cloth is there, and blood stains, and other other details. It just, it is just like it pushes the boundaries, doesn't it?
Well, burial linens or linen cloths can last thousands of years. I actually touched a small piece of Egyptian linen that was, let's see, it was from 4000 BC or 2000 BC, so 4,000 years old. There are Egyptian museums in Cairo and in Turin. Turin's got the second best Egyptian museum.
Turin, Italy?
Yeah, they've got a very good Egyptian museum. But yeah, if linen is cared for, it can last thousands of years. But in the case of the shroud, I think God providentially did preserve it for our age. I think he wanted it, especially for the 20th and 21st century, where we communicate more with images than we do with words. And I think he helped preserve it partially by putting in the hands of families that kept it preserved well over the century. You have to remember, it wasn't like, it was exhibited a lot here and, in different times and whatnot, but some families, were able to keep it hidden for the most part. Yeah, and it escaped the Romans and the Jews, who definitely would have destroyed it. And in fact, that might have been one of the reasons that the images weren't mentioned in the Gospels, because they didn't want to unnecessarily draw attention to it. But there was probably coded language and stuff to give enough information about to people in the know that knew about it in the background, and stuff like that. But yeah, I think God probably pulled a few miracles here and there, not necessarily just in that it still exists, because linen cloths can last that long, but just in the circumstances of avoiding fires and groups that wanted to destroy it and that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, this has been an interesting interview, a little bit off the ordinary. What are your closing thoughts?
Well, I think the shroud right now is, I've been following it since the late 70s, and things were very, the shroud was in the news a lot in the late 70s and early 80s with Stirp, and of course things died down quite a bit after the carbon-14, but it's resurfaced again. I think it's more popular than ever. There's more shroud groups popping up around the world. There's tons of videos and things. I have my weekly list. I usually have 10 to 15 items per week that I tell people about. There might be an electronic exhibition of the shroud in 2025 where people can see it exposed on their computers, tablets, phones, whatnot. I'm working with some people in St. Louis, which is my hometown, for a conference, international conference to be held there next year. I heard another group in Ohio is thinking about having a conference. Things are hopping at the moment. And when I used to lecture in St. Louis, people would come up to me afterwards and say, I'd like to look more into this. And I'd always say, you better be careful. Once you get into it, you may never get out. Because I've literally only known a couple people that were, heavily involved and were able to extricate themselves from from Shroud research, but it has a way of grabbing people and never
Yeah.
letting go.
Yeah.
And I know people, some of my friends have studied it more than 50 years. You know, it just kind of
Is that
grabs
obsessive
onto
compulsive disorder? Is that what you would call it?
Yeah, well, some people will accuse us of being that way, but it's to me, Tom, if this cloth is real, it's worth every second I've spent on it. And I have no, some people say, oh, you're worshiping and this and that, and I'll stand before God with a clear conscience. I'll say, it seems so real. I thought it was real. I was trying to bring people to you. I'm going to get in trouble for that. I don't think so.
I don't think so. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on this Sunday evening, and I'd like to hope that we could see each other face to face. We're not that far apart.
Yeah, maybe you can come to the conference in St. Louis, or if the one comes off in Ohio.
You don't happen to know where it will be in Ohio, do you?
I think it's going to be at the Franciscan University in Steubenville.
Oh, okay. It's along the Ohio River.
Yeah, near. I think it's fairly close to Pittsburgh, but yeah, it's about a 3-hour drive for me from Columbus. But
it'd probably be the same for me too.
Yeah.
Okay, Joe. Well, thank you for this. Thank you for this time.
Anytime, if you want to do it again, let me know.
Okay, maybe I can think about more questions that could be asked. But
sure,
you seem to be an authority on this. So I'd like to say good night to you then, and wish you God's blessing.
Thank you. God bless you too.